Welcome to this GOC Stakeholder Consultation webinar. My name is Rebecca Chamberlain and I'm the Standards Manager here at the GOC. You may be aware that we launched our consultation on proposed changes to our standards on the 14th of February, and we're currently running a series of stakeholder events. We are mindful that not everybody can attend an event and thought it might be helpful to talk through some of the changes proposed in our consultation document in a webinar format so that anybody can listen to what we are proposing. During this webinar, I will be providing a brief update on the Standards Review project, an overview of the proposed changes to the standards, and will explain how you can submit a consultation response. It's important to note that we are very much at the consultation stage of our proposals and they are not a finalised set of proposals. Therefore, we may change our approach as a result of consultation feedback. Before we begin, I thought it would be helpful to provide a gentle reminder about the purpose and scope of the Standards Review. The purpose of the review is to ensure that our standards of practice are fit for purpose and that they reflect the current context within which registrants practice, students are trained and businesses operate. The focus of the review is on the standards of practice for optometrists and dispensing opticians and the standards for optical students. We have proposed some consequential changes to the standards for optical businesses as well. However, we have not undertaken a full review of the business standards. Moving on to an update on the standards review. The first phase of the Standards Review project began in autumn 2022 when a piece of desk-based research was undertaken by the previous Standards Manager. Following that, we reviewed some of our internal data, such as our standards queries and our fitness to practice cases, to identify any areas of practice which we felt could benefit from review. We officially launched the Standards Review project in April 2023, and shortly after we hosted a series of stakeholder conversations to help us understand more about key areas of practice, such as social media and online conduct. We also commissioned a piece of patient and public research to make sure that we heard the patient and public voice. We are now in the second phase of the project, and having analysed the data from the stakeholder conversations and other engagement events, we drafted some proposed changes to the standards. The proposed changes were reviewed by Council in December, and Council agreed for us to consult on the proposals. We launched the public consultation on the 14th of February 2024 and are now focused on delivering a series of stakeholder events to enable us to discuss our approach and obtain some feedback. Once the consultation closes, we will move into the next phase, which will be the final phase of the Standards Review, where we will analyse the consultation responses and prepare a consultation report. We will use the consultation responses to inform final revisions to the standards, which we hope to publish by the end of 2024. Before we move on to discussing the revisions to the standards, I thought it would be helpful to recap on the purpose of the standards. As you may be aware, the GOC has a statutory responsibility to set standards which protect the public and promote and maintain public confidence. The standards are an overarching set of standards which set minimum expectations for registrants in terms of their behaviour and performance. They are not intended to be aspirational or to describe best practice. The standards are not prescriptive and neither are they a set of instructions. The standards are a framework to guide practice, and as such, registrants are expected to apply their professional judgment in deciding how to meet the standards. The standards are intentionally written at a high level and are generic to apply to all optometrists and dispensing opticians, regardless of whether they are students or qualified or where they practice. As we turn our attention to the main focus of this webinar, the next two slides will set out what is staying the same and what is changing in broad terms. So in terms of what is staying the same, in short, quite a lot. Today, of course, we will focus on the changes to the standards. However, when you consider the number of proposed changes in relation to the number of standards across all three sets of standards, you may notice that we are proposing relatively few changes. The format and structure of the standards will also remain the same, so there will be a title standard with sub-standards underneath. The number of standards will remain the same, with 19 standards for optometrists and dispensing opticians and 18 standards for students. However, we have proposed a few new sub-standards. And finally, the purpose of the standards, which I set out in the previous slide, will remain the same. In terms of what is changing, this can broadly be categorised into three main areas. We have proposed some additional statements to be added to the introductory wording of the standards. These statements are explanatory and are intended to support registrants in understanding our expectations. They are not standards in and of themselves. We have also proposed revisions to existing standards, which will help to strengthen the standards and/or to provide more clarity. And thirdly, we have proposed some new substandards to address emerging issues such as sexual harassment and registrant health. During today's webinar, we will focus on 7 key topics which are shown here on the screen. We won't be covering supervision and delegation, registrant health or other changes. However, you can read more about those topics in our consultation document. So let us begin with our first topic, which is leadership and professionalism. During our stakeholder conversations, we heard broad agreement that all registrants should demonstrate leadership, regardless of whether they are qualified registrants or student registrants. We also heard that workplace culture is an important enabler for leadership. Registrants felt that some leadership skills and attributes are already covered within the existing standards, but that maybe they're not recognised by registrants as leadership skills or attributes. We also heard that there's an overlap between professionalism and leadership, which is potentially differentiated by internal and external behaviours. Professionalism was seen as the foundation of good leadership. We heard professionalism described as how an individual conducts themselves, whereas leadership is how those skills and attributes are applied when dealing with others. When we asked stakeholders whether there should be a separate standard for leadership, we heard that their preference was that leadership skills, attributes and attitudes should be woven through the standards as they currently are, rather than being a separate standard. When we conducted our research with patients and the public, we didn't specifically ask about leadership. However, we did ask whether or not there should be any differences in our expectations between qualified registrants and student registrants, and what we heard was that there should be no difference. Therefore, we feel it's reasonable to conclude that this would also be the case with regards to leadership. So to address what we heard on the issue of leadership and to set clear expectations for registrants, we have proposed a new statement to be added to the introduction of the standards. It is important to note that registrants will not be held accountable to this statement, only to the specific standards. Within the statement, we've set clear expectations that registrants should demonstrate leadership, skills, attributes and behaviours relevant to their scope of practice. We have provided some examples of when registrants could demonstrate leadership, though this list is not exhaustive. We have also made clear that the leadership skills, attributes and behaviours are embedded throughout the standards and should be applied to all aspects of a registrant's work. We have proposed the same statement for the standards for optical students, with the exception that that statement does not include contributing to the education and training of others. Now let's move on to the topic of patients in vulnerable circumstances. In our latest public perceptions research, the data indicated that those with markers of vulnerability, for example patients with a disability, are less satisfied with the service they received. Our patient and public research highlighted the importance of registrants maintaining appropriate boundaries to avoid putting patients in vulnerable positions. We are also aware that other regulators are considering the issue of vulnerability, and we are keen to adopt good practice from other sectors. These pieces of research all highlight that something more needs to be done to address the needs of patients in vulnerable circumstances. All registrants are likely to provide care and services to patients in vulnerable circumstances at some point, and we feel it's important that they can recognise signs of vulnerability and take appropriate action. Being in a vulnerable circumstance can affect an individual's ability to engage with healthcare services, to represent their own interests, and to make effective decisions about their care. To address what we've heard on this issue, we have proposed a new statement to be added to the introduction of the standards, which sets out our expectations in relation to the care of patients in vulnerable circumstances. Our interpretation of vulnerable circumstances could include difficult life events, such as a recent bereavement, cognitive impairment, new caring responsibilities, and poor literacy or numeracy. We also recognise that levels of vulnerability may vary between contexts and they may change over time, so we would expect registrants to consider a patient's vulnerabilities as part of each consultation. As stated previously, registrants would not be held accountable to the introductory statement, only to the specific standards. We have also proposed a revision to Standard 7.1 of the Standards for Optometrists and Dispensing Opticians and 6.1 of the Student Standards. Here we have included vulnerabilities within the standard. Our expectation would be that when a registrant conducts an adequate assessment for the purposes of optical consultation, that they consider any vulnerabilities that the patient may display. We have proposed a revision to Standard 13.8 or 12.6 of the Student Standards. We have included the need for registrants to consider and respond to the needs of patients in vulnerable circumstances in the similar way to which they would of patients with a disability. You may also note that we have changed the language from disabled patient to patients with a disability. We have also made a revision to Standard 15.1 or 14.1 of the Student Standards. Here we've made a change to our wording from vulnerable people to people in vulnerable circumstances. We have also made clear that maintaining appropriate boundaries applies to behaviours, actions and communications. We have made a further amendment to Standard 15.2 or 14.2 of the Student Standards, where we have included specific reference to patients in vulnerable circumstances to remind registrants of the importance of not abusing their professional position to exploit or unduly influence patients or the public in vulnerable circumstances. Now we will consider the topic of effective communication. When we reviewed our stakeholder research, our research on refraction, and our recent standards queries, we identified that patients may be unaware of the different roles in optical practices and they don't always know who is providing their care. When we reviewed the high-level principles for good practice in remote consultations and prescribing, we identified two key principles which we felt required further review. The first principle sets out that registrants should tell patients their name and their role and ensure the patient understands how a consultation is going to work. The second principle sets out that patients should be given information about all the options available to them, including declining treatment, in a way they can understand. During our stakeholder conversation on technology and AI, we heard the importance of registrants being able to understand and communicate the potential benefits and risks associated with the use of digital technologies to enable patients to make informed decisions about their care. It's important that registrants can communicate effectively and empathetically with their patients so that patients can give informed consent, understand their treatment, and play an active role in maintaining their eye health. To that end, we have proposed revisions to 3 standards relating to effective communication. The proposed revision to Standard 2.2 would require registrants to identify themselves and their role and to advise patients who will be involved in providing their care. The proposed revision to Standard 7.6 or 6.6 of the student standards mirrors the wording in the high-level principles for good practice in remote consultation and prescribing and will require registrants to give patients information about all the available options, including declining treatment, in a way they can understand. The proposed revision to Standard 4.2 reminds registrants of the need to demonstrate humanity and kindness when communicating bad news. During our stakeholder conversation on technology and AI, we heard that digital technologies have already changed the delivery of optical care and will continue to do so in the future, but that there are differences with the speed in which digital technologies are being adopted across optical services. We heard about the importance of professionals understanding digital technologies that they are using to inform their decisions to ensure that patients can be confident in the quality of the care. As an example, we heard that digital technologies are often developed based on specific data sets which may not reflect the diversity of the population, and when those technologies are rolled out, there are risks of anomalies occurring. We also heard that technology, particularly AI, can be used to support quicker diagnosis, which may give greater opportunities for clinicians to engage with patients and provide care and support. In terms of the regulation of digital technologies, we heard that there is already regulatory infrastructure through the Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency to ensure that medical devices are safe and effective. Therefore, the General Optical Council needs to focus on setting appropriate standards for individuals who will use those digital technologies rather than seeking to regulate the technologies themselves. In relation to technology and AI, we have proposed 1 revision to a standard and 1 new standard. We acknowledge the need to support responsible innovation whilst also protecting patients. The proposed revision to Standard 5.3 requires registrants to be aware of practice developments, including those related to digital technology, to inform the care they provide. This revision recognises that digital technologies are an emerging area of practice, and registrants need to be aware of their benefits and limitations to support delivery of safe and effective care. However, we recognise that not all registrants will work in areas where digital technologies are routinely used. Therefore, we have changed the wording of the standard from apply to the care you provide and replaced it with to inform the care that you provide. We have also proposed a new standard under Standard 7 or Standard 6 of the student standards, which requires registrants to apply their professional judgment when utilising data generated by digital technologies to inform decision making. This addresses the fact that digital technologies are developed using specific patient groups, and when used in the general population, there is a risk of inaccurate results. Registrants need to be alive to the risk and use their judgment when interpreting their data. Now we'll move on to equality, diversity and inclusion. Our 2023 registrant survey found that 41% of registrants had experienced harassment, bullying or abuse from patients or service users in the past 12 months. The survey also found that 16% of respondents had experienced harassment, bullying or abuse from colleagues in the last 12 months. Our recent public perception survey found that 7.9% of ethnic minority respondents had never had their sight tested, compared to 2.6% of white respondents. When we asked about factors that make people feel uncomfortable visiting an optician or optometrist practice, 28.6% of ethnic minority respondents cited the cost of the test, compared to 14.8% of white respondents. While the reasons for these differences may reflect varied factors,
We note that there's more the sector can do to reduce barriers to access. In relation to equality, diversity and inclusion, we have made two proposed changes to the standards for optometrists and dispensing opticians and the standards for students. In terms of the standard for 13.2 or 12.2 of the student standards, we have made clear that registrants must promote equality, value diversity and be inclusive with patients, the public, colleagues and anyone else with whom they have a professional relationship. We have also removed the list of protected characteristics from this standard and replaced it with the term protected characteristics. This is to ensure closer alignment to the relevant legislation and will enable us to future-proof the standards in the event that there are changes to the protected characteristics in the future. We have also proposed a revision to Standard 13.4 and 13.6. We have merged these two standards and made one small change which makes clear to registrants that they should not make unnecessary or disparaging comments about colleagues online. We have also proposed three changes to the business standards on the issue of equality, diversity and inclusion. We have proposed a revision to Standard 2.2.5 of the Standards of Optical Businesses to ensure alignment with the individual standards. We have removed the list of protected characteristics and replaced it with the term protected characteristic for the reasons outlined. We have also proposed an additional standard under Standard 3.3 of the Standards for Optical Businesses. This proposed new standard would require business registrants and employers to provide support for staff who have experienced discrimination, bullying or harassment in the workplace. And this is intended to address the concerns that were identified in the registrant survey. We have also proposed a slight amendment to the title of Standard 3.3 to include the words "and supported." Next, we will discuss the issue of social media and online conduct. During our stakeholder conversation, we heard about the many positive ways in which social media is being used, either for educational purposes and research, or for facilitating communities of practice, as well as raising awareness of eye care and eye health. In the main, current issues related to the use of social media appear to relate to the blurring of boundaries between personal and professional conduct online. We heard that the context in which registrants communicate online and their intent are important factors when considering whether online conduct is appropriate. We heard that existing standards need to be reviewed to capture emerging issues, one of which was that we understand that registrants share patient data such as retinal images over WhatsApp groups for the purpose of second opinions or educational purposes. Registrants felt that the GOC needed to reflect on how to communicate standards and contextualise our expectations. When we conducted our patient and public research, we asked them specifically about the issue of sharing retinal images via WhatsApp, and their views were mixed. The majority felt that WhatsApp was an unprofessional platform for this purpose, particularly as the image would be stored on a person's mobile device. Generally, respondents felt that a practice's own system or email were more professional and secure ways of sharing data. In relation to the issue of consent, the patient and public research found that respondents largely felt patient consent should be obtained to ensure that they have a say, and that this was particularly key for those with eye conditions or vulnerable service users. The issue of social media, online conduct and consent, we have proposed three changes. We have proposed a revision to Standard 14.3 or 13.2 of the student standards to clarify that patient confidentiality must be maintained when sharing patient data images online. We have proposed a revision to Standard 16.6 or 15.6 of the student standards to clarify that registrants should not make misleading, confusing or unlawful statements in their communications as well as when advertising. We have proposed a revision to Standard 3.3 to clarify that patients' consent must remain valid when sharing patient data with others. This revision has been made to reflect the responses from our patient and public research. And now we move to our final topic, which is maintaining professional boundaries. During our stakeholder conversations, we heard that registrants were very clear on the need to maintain professional boundaries between themselves and patients and the public, but were perhaps less clear on the need to maintain boundaries with colleagues. We also heard that some types of practice, such as domiciliary care, may put registrants in situations where maintaining boundaries can be more difficult. Registrants also reported that they weren't clear on how to respond if a patient was to cross boundaries. We heard the impact of crossing boundaries can have on both patients and registrants. In terms of patients, it can affect their trust in the profession, and in the case of a registrant who's experienced boundary crossing, it can impact on their willingness to remain within the profession. The patient and public research that was conducted discussed the issue of maintaining professional boundaries and found that respondents thought the close and intimate nature of eye care may require particular sensitivity around maintaining professional boundaries. We are also aware that sexual misconduct has become a focus for regulators and the Professional Standards Authority in recent years, as they have seen the number of fitness to practice cases relating to sexual misconduct increase significantly. On the issue of maintaining professional boundaries, we have proposed a revision to one standard and 2 additional sub-standards. The revision to Standard 15.1 or 14.1 of the Student Standards sets clear expectations around maintaining boundaries with colleagues and others with whom registrants have a professional relationship, and also clarifies that maintaining appropriate boundaries applies to behaviours, actions and communications. We have intentionally changed the wording of the standard from others that you may come into contact with during the course of your work to those with whom you have a professional relationship, to make clear that boundaries should be maintained both in and outside of the workplace. We have also changed the word proper to appropriate at the start of the standard. We heard through our patient and public research that whilst some boundaries were non-negotiable, such as physical or sexual boundaries, others were more flexible depending on the context of the relationship, for example, conversational, relationship and commercial boundaries. Therefore, we have made this change to allow registrants to apply their judgment in deciding what would be considered an appropriate boundary. We have proposed a new standard under Standard 15 or 14 of the Student Standards, which relates specifically to sexual conduct. This would set clear expectations for the way in which registrants conduct themselves with patients, students, colleagues and others with whom they have a professional relationship. We have used the phrase effect or purpose of causing offence because we want to set clear expectations of registrants that they must not act in this way. The wording mirrors the language used in the General Medical Council standard, which has recently been strengthened in this area. However, we recognise that some registrants are already in relationships with other optical colleagues, and the proposed revision would not prevent appropriate consensual relationships. Finally, we have proposed an additional standard under 3.3 of the Business Standards, which would require business registrants and employers to provide support for staff who have experienced discrimination, bullying or harassment in the workplace, and would interpret this to include where an employee has been subject to sexual harassment or other boundary crossing. I will now move to the final few slides of this webinar, where I will set out how you can submit a consultation response to the GOC. You can submit a response using our online survey, which can be accessed via the Consultation Hub, which can be found in the top right-hand corner of the GOC homepage. We would also welcome responses via email, which can be submitted to our consultation mailbox, consultations@optical.org. We recognise that the consultation is detailed. However, we wanted to be transparent about our decision making and reflect the richness of the conversations we have had and the research that we have undertaken. This has resulted in a lengthy and detailed consultation, and we would welcome both full and partial responses. We also welcome responses in the English or Welsh language, and there are separate links for the English language and Welsh language versions of the survey. If you would like a copy of the consultation document in a different format, please contact communications@optical.org. And finally, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to watch this webinar and to engage with us on this very important piece of work. I would encourage you to respond to our consultation by the 8th of May so that we can hear your views and take them into account when we draft our final revisions to the standards. Thank you very much.